Supervisor Keto, stand, please. Let's just join together in a word of prayer. Father, thank you so much for this day in Shasta County and the opportunity to come together as the Shasta County Board of Supervisors. May the things that we say and do today be honorable to you, and help us, Lord, as we consider the obligations and responsibilities of this elected office. Father, I ask you also to be with those in Shasta County, especially during this time. So many needs, Father. We thank you for your leadership and direction, and literally the way that you hold our hands through every decision and around every corner. We ask your blessing upon this community. In Jesus' name, amen.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. We invite you to join us in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you, Supervisor Bond, Supervisor Keto, and thank you, Supervisor Hartman, for filling in as the chair last week. And I guess Glenn, just thanks for showing up. I didn't want you to feel left out. Our next item is the public comment period. If you wish to speak, we ask you to come forward and give your name. Each speaker is allocated 3 minutes to speak. Comments should be limited to matters within the jurisdiction of the board. Pursuant to the Brown Act, action of board discussion cannot be taken on open time matters other than to receive the comments, and if deemed necessary, we defer the subject matter to the appropriate department for follow-up and or to schedule the matter on a subsequent board agenda. I do have 2 requests at this time. First is Dolores Lucero, followed by Mayor Missy, or I guess actually former Mayor Missy MacArthur.
Good morning. I was here the last meeting. I basically kind of gave you some information regarding the voters. It's basically is when I actually took out my application to basically run again for city council in the city of Shasta Lake. And there's one piece of document concerns me, but besides that one document, there's actually this Tony Coates and Kathy Darlin cannot legally just call each other over the phone and negotiate who's going to be giving the documents. Tony Coates is appointed by the council. Kathy Darlin is elected. Legally, Tony cannot do that. So I'm coming to you basically to oversee the voters' rights. I gave you information regarding the voters' rights because the voters have a right for their privacy. There's a document where I gave you the last meeting. Is a document where it's called nomination. Basically, you go door to door, you get 30 signatures. Those signatures need to be protected. Those voters' rights. So I gave you information regarding their rights of privacy. Those rights of privacy need to be protected by the county. And if it gets to the city of Shasta Lake, it won't be protected. Basically, you'll be giving the information, there'll be a third party, so their rights will be violated. So I'm asking for the board to consider looking into this ordinance or whatever they're trying to pass between the Kathy and Tony Coates over the phone cannot be done legally, like I said, because she's appointed, not elected. Let's see. And also, I gave you some emails regarding threatened emails regarding my life because I'm a whistleblower. Because I like to expose people who break the law. That's why I'm a target. And that's why I'm coming to you, because I think it's important for you to know that the voters have a right. Their civil rights. So their rights cannot be violated. So just remember that. They have a right to be protected, because I have to go door to door and get those signatures.
Thank you, Ms. Lucero.
Thank you.
I think I'll leave it up to our county council to determine if there's anything that needs to be done further on this. Thank you. Next speaker is Missy MacArthur.
Good morning.
Morning.
I wanted to invite you, the electeds, to a workshop that we're having August 20th at 5:15 at the Reading City Chambers, and we'd love to have you there and participate. We're trying to put together a workshop to solve crime in our community, and we want to work together. I know that I was quoted as saying we want to take the lead, but what I meant is that we as leaders should lead, and we realize finances are an issue in our community, and wondering is, are there some ways that we can think outside the box? Can we share resources? Can we share evidence lockers? Can we share maybe having ideas where we post the cost of putting the frequent flyer criminals on Channel 7 News and on the Record Searchlight like they did on Sunday, and not to point that crime is in our community more rampant than anywhere else in the state of California, but rather to say Reading is proactive in taking crime out of our community and work toward that goal together and find solutions. So this would be an opportunity to look outside the box, come up with creative solutions, and brainstorm, and maybe find ways that we can do something. I know Tehama County is doing something with prisoners in like a Crystal Creek kind of situation. Maybe we could open Crystal Creek. Maybe we could ask somebody in the community, are they interested in privatizing jails? You know, maybe they'd like to do something like that. So I want us to be proactive in this and find solutions. So I'm hoping that you'll show up.
Would you go ahead and just give the date, time, and location again?
It is August 20th, 5:15 at the City Chambers.
Great. Thank you, Missy, for the invitation.
Thank you.
That's all the advance requests I have during open time. Seeing no others, then I will move on to our regular calendar, R1. Receive a report from County Executive Officer Larry Lees on the status of implementation of AB 109.
Thank you, Chairman Modi, members of the board. I was asked by the Board of Supervisors to do a review of the current status of our progress in implementing AB 109. As you know, AB 109 was passed, and it's otherwise known as the Governor's Realignment change or law. And I just want to basically, I've left you a report. I want to basically go over some items so that I believe important to note, and then I will get into the crux of what I found in my initial review. First of all, I understand that it's important to note that the participants of those who serve on the Community Corrections Executive Board have been determined by our state legislature. It's not really something that the Board of Supervisors chooses or even the public chooses. It has actually been determined by law, and that was fixed in place by our state legislature. And that AB 109 and accompanied by AB 117 clearly states that the Chief Probation Officer, who is appointed by the presiding judge, not a county function, is the one who is to be the executive chair of the Community Corrections Executive Board, the CCEB. So I think it's important to note where these players come from, and I've noted in the report the specific legislation that addresses this, who's to be the chair, who's to be on the committee, like the police chief, the sheriff, and some players like that. Also, I wanted you to know that I actually conducted individual interviews with each of the Community Corrections Executive Board. For the most part, I also had my principal analyst, Julie Hope, with me for those interviews to make sure that we captured the true feeling and thoughts of what was going on and if we were progressing at a good speed or not. Important also for the board to understand the timeline of when these things started to come to play, and so I've included that in the report. Clearly, the legislation took effect October 1st of 2011. There was some different funding mechanisms that were to be in place, and those dollars have changed a little bit. Probably not significantly. I mean, it's never enough, but we have seen some changes in that. But the legislation took place October 1st, 2011, and that's when they created the post-release community supervision issue, to where that was being transferred from state to county, local. Around September, the Board of Supervisors, prior to this taking place, the Board of Supervisors took action to amend the budget on what we thought the dollars coming in would be. And so we were actually gearing up here prior to the bill and legislation taking place. We actually designated the probation department to be the lead in this, and that was back in July of 2011. So we started early on, even prior to before legislation was to take place. Around the 7th of October, when this was coming in, we actually received our first payment, our first revenue from the state of California, and that was about 2.9 million, I think it was. And there's a financial chart with dates on it in your report also that specifically outlines when those funds were received. But we started receiving our first payment, or the first revenue from the state to handle this 109 stuff around the first of around the October 7th. That was 2.5 million, excuse me, 2.5 million. We actually had some other funding that came in and it brought it up to 2.9, but that's when we started getting money for this. The Board of Supervisors continued to adopt resolutions allowing probation the authority to buy and do certain things without taking the time to have come back to the board. So and then since then have extended that resolution, so they still had that level of authority, so the auditor would be allowed to pay claims and costs associated with this. And there's some other budget amendments that we have done, again, to facilitate this. And then we changed the amount that we were receiving in June. The number that we'd received from the state was to be received was 6.9, and I think that has since been scaled back to about $6.2 million to be received in this first go-round. So that kind of gives us a little idea of the timeline that we're talking about. From there, well, let me sum up, first of all, the revenues and expenditure. As of about 3 weeks ago, when I concluded the investigation on this report, we had received the $2.9 million, little over that, and we had spent about $924,000. So we still have an additional $1.9 million that that will be used to implement the 1112/1213 Community Corrections Plan. And that is being allocated and will be expected to be used. So this takes me to the specific interviews with the Community Corrections Executive Board members. And I asked just a series of 4 or 5 questions. I asked the same questions to each of these Executive Board members. And if you recall, it's about 4 weeks ago, we had 2 or 3 of those Executive Board members speak to the Board of Supervisors, indicating a high level of frustration as far as implementation. So with that, I'm going to give you the summary of the comments, but I'm also going to give you some specific quotes from those members that I interviewed, so that, and I won't put them on the spot and say who said what, but I think it's important you know what the feeling and the tenure is of those that have been charged with facilitating this 109 plan within their level of authority that they have to implement. The first question I asked was, are you satisfied with the realignment implementation progress in Shasta County? So it's kind of and this is a high level, it's a general review, but that was the first question. And the first quote that came out was, it was hastily dropped in the county's lap. That's a quote. And clearly that's the case. It was hastily dropped in 58 counties' laps. Now some counties were further ahead than others because they had been doing things along these lines prior to AB 109, and so they had some of these steps and some of the processes and programs in place. But I will say, when I asked about the implementation progress in Shasta County, there was one committee member that thought that they were making progress, and the quote here was, at a level better than expected. So they felt that they were actually exceeding what the expectations were there. The majority of the board did not feel that same way and believed that there was a high level of frustration with everybody. We then got kind of specific, and we talked about the closing or the opening of the third floor of the jail, and was there a consequence to that? The majority of board members agreed that they needed to have adequate jail space in order to have a desirable level of implementation of 109. And obviously, there was quite a bit of discussion about how to attain that desirable level, or that adequate space in the local jail. As a significant issue, and I actually heard from representatives from the judges on our failures to appear. There's a significant issue as it relates to not having adequate jail space to handle some of the, and we'll call it the catch and release, and those failure to appears when we don't have any leverage or a consequence to those that are not willing to play. There's a lot of things that came out in this discussion about ways to hold people accountable as it relates to whether it be bracelets, whether it relates to work release. But if you don't have that little bit of leverage to have a consequence, if there's no incentive, there's no incentive there for the people to comply. And so, with that being said, the jail was a significant issue. Now, in fact, one of the quotes that came from one of the arresting officers was that, and this is a quote, "Hurry up and get me to jail where I can be booked and back home tonight." Now, with that being said, there's been some significant progress and movement in that, and rather than me go into that right now, I've talked with Sheriff Pasenko, and as part of his 109 report that follows me here, he's going to speak to those specific items that have been in place and how we have already seen some change in behavior because of the action that was taken just over the weekend. And so I'm going to let Sheriff Pasenko talk about that when we get to that point.
Mr. Lees, as we go through this, will you entertain questions?
You bet.
Relative to each one of your questions?
You bet.
And relative to question number one, are you satisfied with the 109 realignment implementation progress? And you quoted one of the members as saying, although one of the members believed that they were making progress at a level that was better than to be expected. Were the expectations written and published?
No, I don't believe so. And you know that gets us to appropriate. I know what you're going to ask next.
No,
Go ahead.
No.
But no, but certainly that would be something that would be appropriate to be included in the community corrections plan, to where you would have some specific, as Supervisor Kehoe always looks for, specific measurements and requirements.
So to summarize then, we had a major community program in AB 109, and there were no written performance expectations that you could discover in your inquiry.
Not measurements. There were expectations as far as the community correction plans and what they were trying to accomplish, but I didn't see the measurement plan.
Thank you.
Question two was, question three, we went on to the consequence of not opening the day reporting center, because that came up in discussions in board meetings. Now, first of all, I think you know, whether we call this a day reporting center or the community corrections center or community assessment center, I think it's important to understand that that's really the mission of this center, in my opinion, from what I understand, and I'm not the expert, is twofold. I mean, we have this day reporting center where there's going to be, where folks are going to be expected to report in and maybe get assignments, maybe have assessments done, maybe be provided with services that will help them get back on the path to rehabilitation and things like that. And so there was a concern that the lack of having this day reporting, and I'm going to, just for the ease of combining the two, call it a corrections assessment center, community corrections center, we'll call it. There was a thought that that was preventing us from being successful in handling some of these folks that we now have stewardship over. In talking with the probation chief, and I know he'll be giving his report here shortly, he assured me that this was not a critical problem, this not being open. Ideally, we need it to be open and we will have it open. But because it's not, it was not a critical problem in that, and I'll quote here, this is a quote, "Everyone is currently being served and assessed by probation." So because we didn't have this day reporting center, community correction center, because we didn't have it, it did not mean that the people that required it were not being assessed. They were continually being assessed by probation at the probation department. And so that was happening. The other thing, there were, you know, as far as, well then, but still, why haven't we gone forward with this? And that came out in some of the discussion. One of the comments from the executive board members actually said, and this is a quote, "There is no reason to have an assessment center when there's no jail space. They just won't show up." And I kind of addressed that a little bit earlier, why there was no leverage for them to show up when there's no consequence. With that being said, I want to debunk the myth, if anyone has that the reason we don't have that open is due to a NIMBYism, that nobody wants it in their backyard. Certainly, there are those that do not welcome a day reporting center in their neighborhood. And so that is a true statement. With that being said, on April 5th, Mr. Starman, the city manager, and I actually met and provided about 5 locations that we thought would be very workable, that makes good business sense, that would make good sense as far as location, and that would be acceptable to the community. So we have some spaces, you know, whether it be the exact square footage that we need or not is disputable, but we do have those spaces, and we are going forward, and in fact, we are in negotiations with a couple of things right now, and because we're negotiating, I don't want to actually be very specific because there's cost involved with that, but we are going forward, and so the question will be, well, then when? And so we have the opportunity to have something up and running. I believe, and I'm kind of looking at Mr. Foreman here, Chief, I believe within 60 days, maybe 90 days to be safe. Now, we can go back and say, well, why is it taking that long? And I believe there's some specific issues around that, and you'll hear me speak to that in just a minute. So just hold that thought.
Mr. Lees?
Yes.
Kind of a combination between item number 2 and item number 3 on your list here. I want to thank the sheriff for his report yesterday that the 3rd floor of the jail is being opened and half of the number of beds are available. But there's a perception there, isn't there, that is a good thing. But the reality is that 128 beds, even when fully staffed and open, is a far fewer number than the needed beds to be able to deal with even the existing challenges prior to AB 109. So doesn't that pretty much say in your report we need another jail?
Well, I will.
Pretty leading question for you, huh?
Yes, it is. I think we need to be clear that I don't believe we will ever be able to build enough jails to house those that need to be incarcerated if we don't have some type of rehabilitation program in place. I think our efforts, and not that we let anybody off the hook, so don't take this anywhere different than it's meant to be. Yes, we need the leverage of the jails, and yes, we absolutely can use another jail. There's no question there. Do we have the ability to fund that? No, not today. In today's environment, no. But I think that's not the only answer. Jails are not the only answer. We can't lose sight of what the intent of 109 is, whether you support it or not, where the intent is, regardless of how much jail space we have, keep in mind that the recidivism rate for the state of California was somewhere around 70 to 75% under its current configuration. That means every 1,000 people that got let out of state prison was going to recommit. I mean, out of every 1,000 people, 700 were going to recommit within a 3-year period of time. So what was happening was not working. And so I don't want to give the false impression that the jail is the only answer, but certainly it is part of the answer.
So your report will cover some of those alternatives?
Actually, yes, and Sheriff Pasenko, again, and we talked about this, will be speaking to some of those alternatives also in his report this morning.
Thank you.
Now, the next question was, do you believe the committee has failed? You know, the committee, and this was interesting because we heard some executive board members come to the board meeting in public session with a high level of frustration as far as the results of not moving forward in what they deem to be an appropriate way. And the majority of folks of the executive board that I interviewed said, no, we have not failed. We have not failed. But, and here is the exact quote, the early on lack of acknowledgement of the magnitude of the problem with the failure to execute. They believe, one person believed that to be the problem. So when I'm interviewing about 6 people, 2 of them did believe they did fail, but the majority felt that no, it's just that we underestimated the difficulty of what we were trying to accomplish here. And again, we're not the only county that was in this situation. There's about 56 other ones. A couple of counties were already on board. So I thought that was interesting. Although the majority felt the committee had not failed, this quote came out, "Nobody is happy. It is an impossible task, and we have not made enough progress." And so they identify with the fact that there has not been enough progress made, but they don't believe the committee has failed overall, except for the 2 that said they just underestimated. So what could have been done differently? And here I'm going to get into some specific recommendations, but the executive board had little input as far as what they would have done differently, except they believed that they needed to be more decisive. A concerted effort could have been made to create additional jail spaces in the community assessment center. But basically, they had little input as to what could be done differently. Now, I provided with you kind of my own observations of what I think might help us move along here. And as you see in the recommendation, I don't want to forget the fact that there's this high level of anxiety and frustration everywhere with the public, with the committee, with the electeds, with everyone. And so, again, we are not unique here in Shasta County with what's going on. But with that being said, I think that there's a couple things that I see would help facilitate quicker progress. Number one is I believe that we need to recommend to the executive director, and that would be our probation chief, and the 109 executive board, to look at using 109 funds to help designate a Project 109 administrator. There's all kinds of things that we're already doing within our jobs. We've been handed this extra, hundreds of people to monitor and watch, and then we've got this other thing left on top of us where we're trying to get real estate deals done, we're trying to get jails open, we're trying to do all these things. And I believe that there needs to actually be I believe the chief probation officer needs help. I think he needs someone to help him, to help coordinate, designate, work with the Community Correction Executive Board. I think that could be an answer. Now, I know that there is additional costs associated with that, but there are dollars in there, and I think at least for a temporary, even if it's just a temporary position until we get things up and going, and that could be 6 months, 8 months, I think that would be something for us to consider recommending to the board. The executive board, when I say that. The second thing is identify specific timeline and specific steps to be taken when the assessment center is to be open, with weekly updates to me. I find that, and not that I find that sometimes the CEO is in a position to help facilitate faster movement and guide us through a lot of the bureaucracy that could block or detained us going forward. And so I'm looking to say, let's have specific weekly updates. It might not change from one week to the other, but let's be accountable and have reportable action that's coming back to me by week so I can report to the board and say, this is where we are at in this process.
For a project administrator, do you have in mind a period of time that person would be employed? Or are we talking about a continuous time frame? And what type of qualifications would that person need to have?
You know, I actually...
Where do you find a guy like that or a gal like that?
Well, I'll tell you what entered my little mind, and that'll be the quote that Mike Mangus keeps.
Elena was writing it down, and so was Bruce.
It may be the one we all keep.
I was looking at an experienced retiree that might be willing to come back extra help for 6 to 8 months. Now, there could be somebody within the probation organization that is in a position to step up, and that would be their only role. But right now, and although we have flown the job with not much success, we are short a deputy position in deputy probation chief in probation department. And so we're already short there. And then with this new stuff thrown onto us, I think that's where I was going, with somebody that may have that expertise that's retired that would like to come back for 6 or 8 months to help. But I'm not looking, I don't believe, and certainly the committee could tell me differently, I don't believe it needs to be something long-term.
Okay.
I don't think it needs to be a permanent position at this point. I think when we get the assistant position filled, that's going to give additional resources to the probation department, where they're going to be in a different shape. When we're up and running, it's just going to be more fine-tuning and changing, and so I think it will be easier. So I'm not looking for a permanent position to be added. That would not be my recommendation. We go to the next one. We've talked about the identify step line, a timeline with specific steps to be taken with the assessment center. I also asked for the same thing on the 3rd floor of the jail, and certainly incorporated with this would be steps that may involve a new jail. With that being said, again, I'm going to leave that to Sheriff Pasenko to report on that here shortly, and he's going to give us and provide the update as to where we're at that. This does not become as important at this point, that recommendation going forward. And then, I think this was Supervisor Kehoe's point, as he typically brings up, performance standards and measurements. And that's where I thought, you know, direct me, or it'd be my recommendation that I meet with the presiding judge and the court executive officer and actually talk about how we could include measurements, performance measurements and standards that relate to 109 success, include that in the standards that's going to be accepted and expected by the chief probation officer. The reason I say the court executive officer and the presiding judge is because, again, that position is actually under the direct supervision and appointment by the judge, by the presiding judge and the court executive officer. So I would like to, you know, get the board's blessing to go forward in meeting with them so that we can make sure that we have clearly identified performance standards and measurements on what the expectations are to be accomplished. I think that's an important piece that was missing from the performance plan. With that, I am going to stop there. I think I have said enough. I wanted to keep this at a little higher level, but I know it was important to get some of the specifics and details in there. And so this is the findings of my interviews with the Community Corrections Executive Board. And again, I know some of this will be addressed as far as our progress when we have our 109 report that immediately follows my presentation. So with that, any other questions for me, or do you want to jump to now the 109 report?
Mr. Kehoe, you want?
Thank you, Chairman Modi. Mr. Lees, why don't we start at the beginning? In my mind, the paramount reason that we have not been successful to date is there is a lack of accountability. So let's go back to the first page of your report and identify the individuals, and you don't have to mention their names, identify the positions that compose this executive committee. The chief probation officer, chief of police, the sheriff, the district attorney, the presiding judge of the Superior Court, the head of the Department of Social Services, and then we've added the public defender. Out of those 7 individuals, how many are directly accountable to you and in turn the Board of Supervisors?
Two. 2 are directly accountable to me. That would be the...
So, 5 members of the executive board or committee are accountable to the voters and to the city council and presiding judge. So, where do we have the authority to mandate anything? I mean, ultimately, who's calling the shots here?
Whereas the Board of Supervisors actually do not have authority to mandate something, we do have the responsibility and authority to approve the community correction plan. So when a plan is proposed and brought forward, and this board did actually approve the 11-12 community correction plan, and we're getting ready, I think, to bring the 12-13 plan here within a few weeks, I think, or so. We'll have the opportunity at that point to approve or not approve that plan or amend that plan. Now, let's say we have an amendment that we want to add, that you, the Board of Supervisors, would like to add to that. What happens there is that it gets sent back to the Community Corrections Executive Board for their review and analysis. Typically, I would expect that they would accept the board's recommendation. That was a very iffy statement. I recognize that.
I think you put together a cogent, hard-hitting report that's right on the mark. But just for the sake of discussion, suppose that the executive board, in their wisdom, is unwilling or unable to follow these recommendations or any that they may add, then what authority does this board have? What options does this board have under the aegis of AB 109? And maybe, I don't expect an answer now, but maybe you and county council can review what options we do have available to us.
I could answer a portion of that, if you'd like. But I'd be happy. Let me just answer one portion. Where if a community corrections plan is not approved by the Board of Supervisors, that means the auditor's office will not have the authority to pay claims out of that fund, out of those dollars. And there's another half to your question that we'd have to have legal counsel review, and I don't know what happens if we refuse to pay because we don't accept the plan. I'm not sure where it goes from there, but I think we do have a little bit of leverage in that if we don't accept the plan, then we're not authorizing the auditor's office to pay claims from that.
And I'm sorry, just as a reminder, doesn't it take a 4/5 vote to not approve the plan? Otherwise, it's approved?
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah, so just make sure we understand. If you could have 3 supervisors who disagree with the plan, but that would not be enough.
Right.
Mr. Keel, you had further?
So there's 2 dimensions here, Mr. Lees. There's the construction of the plan, which, let's say for discussion, we all approve of it, and then there's the implementation. Now, we can have the best plan in the world, but if it's not implemented in a timely, effective, efficient manner, it's nothing.
Supervisor Haas.
Thank you. I wanted to start by introducing and welcoming Pam Giacometti in, my replacement come next January, so welcome, Pam. The other thing that I wanted to mention, you know, we can work on these things forever, but until we have an economy and some jobs for these people, the recidivism rate is going to stay high. If they don't have work and they're desperate, they repeat. And it goes on and on. And you mentioned the NIMBYism thing in this report. Well, that's with everything that comes before this board now. So how do we create jobs when we have people out there saying no to everything that comes here? It's pretty difficult, and I really think that we've got to get past this jealousy thing of the sales tax issue between the cities and the county. We've got to get past that, or we're not going to cure this problem. It's a great idea to get together and discuss things, but without some kind of agreement between all of us, we're just not going to get it accomplished. And I think that is the big issue that we need to work on. So that's the challenge of future boards and future councils, is to work on that and get it behind you and have some jobs for these people, and they won't be breaking the law so often, I don't think. But a great report. I mean, we're doing the best we can, I think, under the circumstances, and pushing the issue a little bit here is good. And I think it's a good idea to have somebody overseeing the program, because everyone you know, in our workforce is extremely busy, so it's hard to get the necessary time to do this. So, good job. Thank you, Mr. Lees.
Supervisor Ball.
Thank you, Chair Modi. And Mr. Lees, thank you for your presentation, taking the time to go through this, to talk one-on-one, to make the observations that you've made, and to also conclude with some legitimate recommendations. I appreciate that. I know you'll bring them back to the board for our consideration, and we'll make recommendations to the committee. Regardless of who has the authority and who is responsible for what has been accomplished and what hasn't been accomplished, the number one question of importance to the public is, are we doing everything we can to assure their safety? That's the last question I have, and I don't know how you answer it, Mr. Lees. Are we doing everything we can to assure the safety of the public within our means and authority?
I don't have that answer.
I didn't think you would. It's a big question, isn't it?
Well, I'll just add my comments. I agree with Supervisor Hawes that the economy certainly has a major impact on what's going on, but I think I'd also agree with the comments that have been made previously by the police chief and by the sheriff, which is you've got to have accountability. If you're going to have programs, you've got to have accountability at the end. It's the same thing the judges have when they put them on probation like that. They know that they don't follow through, that they throw them in jail, and they have a hammer on them. I think that's something we've got to work on. And I think what's very frustrating to me here is the state, in its infinite wisdom, again, has given us a program, provided us 5 bosses for one program. You know, you got the police chief who reports to his council, you got the sheriff who's elected, you got the probation officer who reports to the judges. It goes on and on. It's a terrible system. And again, I don't know what they were thinking, but it doesn't surprise me. I think what I would suggest, my thought is, rather than perhaps hiring an additional person to do this, I would like to see if maybe the committee would look to see if they would consider a co-chair as part of their committee, and perhaps someone on the committee would be willing to step forward to help take part of the lead role to get some things done. I think there are some people on the committee who are very aggressive, and you could do that. And I think it would maybe be helpful to the chief probation officer, since he doesn't have a deputy chief probation officer right now, puts him in kind of a hole to start with, so he's probably trying to do a lot of his own work there as well as this. So that would be my consideration, to maybe think about having someone else step up and help take over part of those responsibilities. I think it have to be co-chairs, because again, the state's told us that one person is for sure the chair. So that's my thoughts. Anyone else?
Can I just conclude with one comment?
Sure.
I just, before we go to the other 109 presentation, I want to, and you've heard me say this before, but I do want to remind the board, and this is not a vote for any propositions in November, but if the propositions if the governor's proposition in November does not pass, then dollars allocated for this program are at risk. And so the dollars that we have received, I mean, we'd keep, but any new additional dollars for ongoing programs and positions would be at risk. And again, this is not saying you need to vote for it or not vote for it, or maybe the money's somewhere else. I'm just saying, as the state budget is currently set up, these could be at risk. And I think that's important to keep in the back of our minds, knowing going forward that what the state will have accomplished is moving the level of responsibility away from the state to the counties, and then not have a permanent funding stream to support that responsibility.
And you're surprised?
Yeah, your point is.
Yeah. Supervisor Haas?
It's a good thing he's tying it to education, because I don't think people would really understand all of this, and might have a chance, but to vote to raise taxes in the history of California, especially Shasta County, it just doesn't happen. So I don't know. We'll just have to wait and see what happens. But I know that we'll be hit hard, a lot harder, if it fails.
Supervisor Kehoe.
Mr. Modi, before we move on to the presentations, is there value in the board formally accepting Mr. Lees's recommendations in the form of a motion and a second and a vote? If so, I would suggest that we add to the recommendations, and I think you've covered it in your report, but let's formally do it, and that would be to direct the CCEB, which is the executive board, to establish specific performance standards and measurements, and to report to the Board of Supervisors, the CEO, and in turn the members of the public, the results thereof on a monthly basis.
I'll look to County Council for some direction here.
Thank you, Chairman. The agenda for today's action was to receive the report from the CEO, Mr. Lees, and there was no indication there of any further action identified on the agenda. Of course, there's certainly nothing wrong with requesting that it be placed on the agenda for further action and consideration.
Very good. I recommend we do that for next week then.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Kehoe. Seeing no others, then we will move on to R2, the monthly progress report from Chief Probation Officer Foreman. Welcome, Chief.
Thank you. Chairman Moni, members of the board, I'm Wes Foreman. I'm the Chief Probation Officer. And we'll make sure that the slides are available. Okay. Okay, each month I stand before you and report on, with some numbers on the activity that is the responsibility of the realignment team, and specifically the probation department. What I'll be reporting on this time is very similar to last month with the change in numbers. It is updating it through the end of June. So our presentation is about 3 weeks behind, and that's so that we can actually collect and organize the data. So this first slide is in regards to the population of post-release community supervision individuals that probation receives for supervision. This slide is to represent what the projections were from the state and what the actuals are that we are receiving. What the bullets say up at the top is that we've actually we're projected to receive 248 individuals, and we've actually received 323 individuals from the state. Now, we are only supervising 277, and what that means from the 323 to the 277 is that some of those individuals that receive actually are responsibilities of other counties, and so once we realize that their home, their location of residence is someplace else, then we have to go through the process of transferring those. There's actually been a few that have terminated probation or terminated community supervision as well, so those numbers were reflected there. The actual number that we're supervising now as of June 30th is 277. So the graph there, and I'm aware that what you have in front of you is not colored. So the higher bars reflect what the actuals are, and the lower bars primarily reflect what the projections are. In other words, to say that the projections are the first bar and the actuals are the second bar. And what this slide represents is that the actuals actually were coming in far greater than the projections from the state. It is important to note, however, that in the last group of bars in June, that the actuals are actually less than projections. And so there is a progressively a line that is getting closer and closer to what their actual projections are.
Mr. Foreman?
Yes.
For the benefit of those in the audience and the board, going back to that first slide, could you explain the significance of those factors?
Well, the significance, we formed our plan. In particular, we made a recommendation with how many probation staff needed to be hired in the plan that we submitted in September for your approval. We based those numbers on the projections, okay? And when the actuals start coming in higher than that, then obviously that is a concern to us to see whether or not we're going to have the right projections of hiring staff. We have, in terms of what our caseloads are for probation, are 1 to 50 for this realignment population, and we have been able to either hire or transfer within the agency officers that would adequately supervise this population. We set a priority within the agency that this was the toughest population for us to supervise, and we wanted to make sure that we adequately supervised them. So that's initially what the big concern was. Now, the state explained the change in the actuals by an anomaly, which for us became something that we weren't aware of, and that was that if a person who was on parole, so prior to alignment, they were supervised by parole, if a person on parole met the standards of the new sentencing guidelines, 1170H, that would then come and be post-release community supervision individuals after they served their time in prison. If a person on parole met that standard and had already been revoked, was sent to prison, and received a sentence, a revocation sentence, that kept him in custody after November 1st, that they could be reevaluated and come then to the county after they were released. That number was not in the original projections. And so that was a surprise to us. And so the state has explained it, that says that in the first 6 months or so, you're going to see this spike, but it should gradually even out after that.
Thank you.
This graph refers to the individuals that the county now can no longer send to prison based upon the changes in the sentencing. We refer to these individuals as mandatory supervision individuals or local prison individuals. There was a projection also from the state based upon past historical numbers that said that so many individuals from your county would have been sent to prison, and in this category we're expecting that level to be fairly consistent. What we've seen here in Shasta County is the actuals are far less than the projections. And as I explained last month, there's a bit of, now that we're understanding maybe why that is happening, but part of it has to do with the courts just getting used to using these kind of sentences, managing whether or not they, how to sentence the individuals, and the numbers are coming out a little bit strange. In combination of this slide and the slide I previously showed you, the actuals that we're receiving are in total less than the projections if you use this population and the other population. So those are actual numbers I'm representing. There are potentially reasons for that, which I can share a little bit later on.
Chief Foreman,
Yes.
could this be partly attributable to the fact that many of our arrestees are not getting to court?
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes, and that's the slide later on will represent that. This is a way of establishing some measure in terms of how well we're doing. It's not a great measure at the moment. It's not completely apples to apples, but it helps define a little bit about how probation evaluates whether they're managing what they're supposed to be doing. Our definition of recidivism is a subsequent criminal conviction while under our supervision. So somebody goes through court, they get a sentence, which includes probation, supervision. While we're in charge of them, we want to know if we're doing the job well. And if they commit another crime, we see that as a recidivism number and not doing our job as well. So a lower number would be best for us, okay? Within the realignment population, we don't have historical data, we only have as going forward data. And the first or the second bullet there indicates that of the 277 that we are currently supervising, there has so far been 12 new criminal convictions. Last month I reported there were 10 based upon the number that we were supervising. Both months it comes out to about 4%. It can partly be explained that we're not getting a lot of people into court on the failures to appear, why those numbers are low. But nonetheless, I'm still reporting just an actual number at this point. To try to provide some bit of comparison to that, we evaluate our felony probation, our regular probation, the job that we were always doing even before realignment, and we evaluate that recidivism numbers by comparing a fiscal year of all the individuals that terminate from probation within that year, and then evaluating whether or not during the time they were under our supervision, whether they committed another crime while they were being supervised by us. And that number that we have at this point is fiscal year 10-11, and it's 24%. So comparing the 4% to 24, it's not a great way to evaluate it, but it gives some reference, okay? And this month I added in the state average. There's only 33 counties that actually can report this information, but of those 33 counties, the average recidivism is 17%. So in Shasta County, our recidivism number is a little higher than the average of the state. This gets to the heart of what we're beginning to learn about the impacts to our community. The lower bar, the smaller, shorter bar, is actually the numbers that probation is supervising, so that refers to the post-release community supervision bookings. And the higher number are those that are being supervised by parole. You'll notice that there's a large discrepancy between those bars. And what this slide is intending to represent is activity that is happening in the jail based upon actions that offenders are doing in the community. From the probation's point of view, the impact hasn't been that great. So of the 277, the shorter bar there, you can see month by month how many times we've had to book somebody into the jail for some kind of consequence. And that number is not significant to, in comparison to any other probation supervision we've been doing. Just stating it that way. But you can look at the comparison with the parole. Is that those individuals that are still being supervised by parole are creating quite a lot of activity in the jail. And that is an impact that we didn't quite expect. There has been some reports that the activity after realignment was a little higher, but nonetheless, all I'm reporting is from January on. I don't have numbers from before that. The number in May is obviously a spike in that, and you'll notice that in June that the parole bookings were significantly lower. If you take out May, then that is going down. I don't know how to explain what the activity, why there was so much activity in May. I don't have that information. What I can say is that as realignment continues forward, part of the population that parole is supervising are the same level of individuals that eventually will be the responsibility of the counties. So the number of individuals that parole will be supervising going forward will continue to drop, which may affect the number of bookings going forward as well. This is to identify a little bit of the impact on the court, which we're now beginning to understand. The top one is not so unusual. This is our activity in probation. The 90 refers to how many revocation hearings, reports we've initiated since October 1st to the end of June. and it's on the 277. And that, 32% is a little bit higher than initially. Revocation hearings are slowly creeping up. I have a little bit of graph that you don't have that I'll show that number and how it looks. But I can just report to you that 32% is higher than what I reported in terms of revocations last month and the months before. The second bullet refers to what has become a bigger concern recently is that we're having trouble right now, it seems, getting individuals to their court hearings. If they don't get to their court hearings, they can't get sentenced, they can't get the consequences, they can't get probation, they can't get the services, they can't get some of the other things that we're trying to manage through realignment. Now, that is significant for us, and we're trying to manage that, but it is a significant concern for us. These next two graphs will just this is the revocation, so this kind of shows it graphically, the number of revocations beginning from January on. 15 to 18 at the most is, when you look at those actual numbers, is not tremendously large difference between what probation officer is doing in writing revocation hearings. But if you look at it, it does indicate that it's going up, which, in terms of actual numbers, again, our population is increasing. So in January, I can't remember what the number is we were supervising, we revoked 15 individuals. In June, we have now 277 that we're supervising, and we've revoked 18. As the number grows, you would expect our revocation activity to grow.
Chief Foreman, you mentioned that our population is increasing. Are you referring to the probation population, parole population, or general?
The realignment population, I'm sorry. And this is a graph now when we talk about the 692, as I mentioned a couple slides before, I actually added a graph to that indicating what that means month by month. The lower bar refers to the number of defendants. The higher bar refers to the number of cases. So one defendant can have multiple failures to appear. I prefer to look at, I put both of them here, but for our sake, the number of defendants is a number that is of concern to me. Now, we want to reduce all the activity and stuff, but you can definitely see that from October through June, the average month of failures to appear is slowly creeping up, so that is a concern. There's been discussions in the past about what the difficulty is in hiring staff, and this is only probation's report on that. The only change in this is the bottom line and the bottom bullet. We currently have in our second recruitment 24 candidates that we're now moving through the final interview process for the possibility of them moving to background and hiring more staff. So with that, I'll turn it over to the sheriff, and I want to make sure that we can get his slides now.
Good morning, Tom DeSanko, Sheriff. In regards to our progress with the realignment, we did open the other part of the floor of the jail yesterday, which will provide 64 additional beds than we've currently had with the floor of the jail being closed. As I said in the slide, it shows 60 inmates, and that's why it's 128 beds on the floor, so roughly 64 beds there. Our plan moving forward is to use the floor in a little bit different way, and that's for the worst felony offenders who have failed to appear in court for their sentencing. I think there are close to 500 offenders that have been convicted of crimes, felony crimes, and then have failed to appear for their sentencing. Ms. Fowler-Bradley, are those 500 individuals, or they could have multiple cases? So those are 500 individuals. Some may have multiple cases, but close to 500 individuals. And our focus is going to be get those people incarcerated into court for sentencing. We can also use those beds there, albeit small, for the parole violators and the other offenders like for probation for flash incarceration. I'm going to have a slide a little bit later regarding the actual what's housing in there. The hiring is going along. There are 2 officers that are currently in backgrounds. We need 2 to get them up and hired so we can get the remainder of the floor open. We're pushing forward with that as hard and as fast as we can while maintaining standards, and it is a top priority for me and my staff to get them hired and trained so we can get that other half of the jail floor open. There was a new recruitment that just closed. The application period closed. We had about 260 applicants. Those were screened to the job specs of about 216 people. Will be taking the next series of examinations that includes a written test, oral interview, and then a physical ability test. And then those top people will move into backgrounding investigations there. We've also hired 4 service officers in the last 2 weeks. And those also had a new application period. That was a much smaller pool of people. With 30 applicants, we need to hire a couple more for work release.
Sheriff Pasenko,
Yes, sir.
relative to Diamond number 2, plan to house flash incarcerations, would you explain to us what's involved there?
A flash incarceration is usually a person that is on supervision and maybe they violated a term of their condition of probation. Let's say the probation officer asked for them to report into the probation office for whatever reason they needed to speak with them. The person failed to appear, which would also be a violation of their term, and they can incarcerate them for a very short period of time for a consequence lesson in not showing up and following the orders of the probation officer. So that can be, under law, that can be for a period of up to 10 days.
Might you use that for your work release program as well?
We will be using that as well, and in addition to, I have a little bit different part for home electronic monitoring, maybe for those work release people that don't show up, in addition to a flash incarceration, then they can be electronically monitored for that. You've seen a little bit in the media with contract beds. We have currently secured 2 contracts with Lassen and El Dorado counties. We're planning to getting those onto the agenda for the next regular scheduled meeting of the Board of Supervisors for review, recommendation to approve, and hopefully that will go through. That process also needs to be approved by the other county boards of supervisors. And I know that in Lassen County, their board will not be meeting for the next 2 weeks just because of their regular schedule there. There was a change in the law effective July 1 that allowed sheriffs to contract out-of-county bed space with non-contiguous counties. And when that became law, July 1, we started immediately working and researching of where those beds were available. The price of the bed varies from $60 per day per offender to $125 per day per offender. They're not pre-reserved beds, should I say. We're not paying for a bed that we're not occupying. So that's good to save some money there. So it's not a solve-all. I'll be going before the executive board soon to request additional funds to cover this incarceration. But if you had, sir?
What do you figure it costs us to house a prisoner per day?
It's between $80 and $100 a day. So it's right in the same ballpark. Usually smaller counties such as Shasta, Lassen, those are lower cost. And bigger counties sometimes are higher cost, a lot of it due to salaries and benefits and operation of their jails.
Sheriff Pasenko, the costs that you've identified, are those absorbed by AB 109 as opposed to the general fund?
Currently, yes. We have a very limited amount of out-of-county money for out-of-county beds. And then I'll be presenting to the board, executive board, for the Community Corrections Partnership on Wednesday requesting additional funds. And then, of course, we'll be bringing that to the Board of Supervisors for recommendation and approval. It is not cheap, and it is not a solve-all solution. If you had 100 inmates at an average of $100 a day for 365 days of housing, that would be a little over $3.6 million annually. That type of money is not in the community corrections plan because we can't use all of it for strictly the incarceration of inmates. We still have to provide probation services and other services for the offenders as well. And so that it does have to get spread out because the funds are limited.
But I do assume you've got some money you've banked for the last 6-8 months because
We can also,
the jail's not been open.
yes, we can be utilizing that, do a budget transfer, and that's also in the plan to make those dollars go a maximum part away. The next one is our compliance team, and they've gone out and made contacts during the month of June, 86 contacts, 8 of them in there. Some of the actual attempted contacts, many of the people that we book, they give us false addresses. They may say that they're living with their parents, and then when we go there to check the address that they have provided, that's false. The people may say that we haven't seen the person in 2-3 weeks, a month, or a year, but they have provided us a false address, so then we'll have to go out and try and investigate to see where they are. We did an additional 16 searches in June, made 10 arrests over the time period, one of which was in June. And like I said, many of those don't give the current address. The expanded work release program, we have nearly 200 on the program now. It's being run out of the jail. When it does expand further, we'll be putting those down at the old location. And to expand that out, we want to expand it to 500 for the next fiscal year, and preferably it would be off-site, but we'd return to the Breslauer area, which we utilized before. Most of the inmates are what we call on a report card system, where they're ordered to report to a specific location for work. Some do show up, but as we get this accountability built back in with the jail bed space, I think that number is going to go up significantly. And then as we incorporate home electronic monitoring for those with GPS capabilities, that's also going to increase, because then if a person fails to comply and show up, we can go and track that person down and bring them back into custody. The hierarchy, there's significant concerns for additional jail bed space being much needed. When you have the inmates that are currently in custody, you see the statistical data there. Currently, as of the early to mid part of July, having 24 people in on homicide charges, another 16 on rape or sex crimes charges, robbery, assault, and kidnapping, burglary, which is the worst burglars, because some people do get arrested for burglary and released, drug charges, and the weapons violations. All that total from that previous slide is nearly 200 people with a total jail population of 223. It left at that time, remember the jail floor was not reopened at that point there, only 25 beds for those that are for booking and new ones. And of the 198, you see there that 24 are serving multi-year sentences of up to 8 years. In addition, it'd be in excess of 1 year, up to 8 years. And of those, there are also parolees that are serving their time of up to 180 days. And that does also not count all the parole violators that come in and pending the follow-up. I'll go back to that one slide there. With opening the new floor, or not the new floor, but the current floor of the jail that was closed for a while, it expands our capacity up to 317 inmates. 90% of that, if you remember that we're operating under a mutual agreement between the county and the sheriff that was approved or recognized by the court back in 1993, putting it at a 90% cap, that gives us about 285 before releases have to occur. It is very common to operate between 85 to 96% of the rated capacity at the time. That's why we have the capacity releases. However, with the opening of the floor of the jail, I already received an email this morning from my staff, and it brought quite a smile to my face. They had booked about and been able to hold about 12 people that had warrants for failing to appear or parole violation, and they gave me an example of just 4 of those 12. One was a post-release community supervision person, a PRCS. Another one was a active parolee, and 2 others had active warrants. Out of all those 4 individuals, they had warrants for failing to appear, and additional charges was over 30 outstanding warrants. And that's what we're trying to get back into custody so they can be taken into court, have their cases heard, and if they're adjudicated with the sentence, be able to ship them out of custody. We do have plans for those 500 individuals that have outstanding warrants that have been convicted but not yet sentenced to go out and pay them a visit and see if we can get them in custody, and then when they are sentenced, they can be incarcerated in other county jails. And some of these offenders that you may see for parolees that are serving those 180-day sentences, or those ones that are on longer term sentences, we can move them around between other counties to give some flexibility for the accountability component of the incarceration. And if we can get them into custody, in some cases that can also assist probation to implement their services and programs that they have. That concludes my part of the presentation. Are there any questions?
There are some questions here, and I have one. Could you talk just a little bit about, with AB 109, I think you talked about this the other day, I know the police chief did as well. It's not just the case of the release of prisoners from the state prisons, it's the changing the sentencing laws to those who no longer go to prison, and now you, instead of having someone there for 6 months, they get sentenced to your jail for 6 years.
That's exactly right. And as in the slide that you saw earlier, we have inmates that are serving up to 8 years here in Shasta County Jail. There's one that's to be sentenced to a potentially up to 12 years here, and that's going to really clog up the system, cause a huge bottleneck. There's another offender that's in Southern California that has been sentenced to jail for 28 years. Another one in another Southern California county sentenced to 23 years. And it makes it very difficult. And then at the end of the legislative session ending June 30th, a whole nother bank of laws were changed, adding them to AB 109 for sentencing, that again, rather than go to prison, these offenders will do time in county jail. All of that occurred at the worst time in California history, when we're having the low economic problems here. Nearly 40 of the jails in California have some type of capacity releases because they haven't been able to build jails, Shasta County included. And then this shift of inmate population coming back to the counties, where do you put the people? And I was in a meeting last week with other sheriffs, and it's not anything as an excuse, but it explains the severity of the problem statewide. They're seeing the exact same thing in their counties as well, having to do releases, having challenges to get floors of their jail open, people recruited, and then the state is exacerbating the problem by adding more laws for sentencing and a potential for funding to be cut. We did see a reduction due to a change in formula recently, and as Mr. Lees reported on, we were expected to get about $6.9 million, and now that's down to 6.2, so we suffered a loss in a year, over just a few months. That's why they redid the formula for the larger counties, that Shasta County was negatively impacted by about $700,000.
It's also my understanding that with these changes in the past, when you sent someone off to state prison and they had medical problems, then the state was sort of on the hook to take care of those problems. Now, if they're going to be in a county jail, those costs are going to be passed on to us and our general fund.
That is a big concern. And then also, in expanding, I was looking at some of my notes because we made some last-minute changes that we were unable to get onto the slides. In addition to the contract beds that you heard about with the other counties, There is no county in the state of California that currently has a contract with the state of California, CDCR, for fire camp beds. And those are important because those are about $46 a day. I rounded off to 50 just for easy math. That would be about $18,000 a year for incarceration. There's certain qualifications that inmates must have to pass medically and physically in training to occupy those. The state sheriffs have been in negotiations with the CDCR since implementation of AB 109 and has still not been able to come to an agreement for all the terms of the contract. I have reviewed, and my undersheriff has reviewed, the latest version of the contract. We have that over with county council now, looking at the terms to see if it would be amenable to Shasta County's application. And I have had conference calls with the Undersecretary for CDCR regarding the contract and continuing to move forward. There have been other impacts that the state is imposing on counties as well. They're looking at consolidating reception centers. And reception center is a state prison that not only incarcerates inmates, but also receives those inmates on the new sentences, and then from the reception center, they're assigned to prisons throughout the state. One of those reception centers was High Desert State Prison, but the state will be consolidating their reception centers and moving High Desert Reception Center to the Tracy area. That will add, for Shasta County, add about an 8-hour round trip in transportation, and then many of the Northern California counties will have to go to that reception center as well. So we're anticipating long lines of processing inmates to be accepted into the state prison system that could have additional costs, not only in transportation, which we do get a small amount of reimbursement for mileage, but it doesn't cover the complete cost, but then you may end up in lodging and food costs for the amount of time that the staff will be on the road there. We do combine with other counties and partner with them. If they're making a trip down and we have, say, one inmate to take down to state prison, they'll pick up our inmate, take them down there for no cost, and then maybe the next week, if we're going, we'll take their inmate and transport them down. And it's a very good working partnership that we have for other sheriffs throughout the state for transportation of inmates.
Supervisor Ball.
Thank you, Chair Modi. Sheriff, thank you for a great report, and I think a lot of additional information that we have not had, so I appreciate that very much. And thank you, Chief Foreman, as well, for your report. My question is for Chief Foreman.
Also, in regards to, there has been some discussion regarding Crystal Creek. That was a state-owned property, and the sewer system was in bad repair. It's been so heavily vandalized that it's scheduled to be scuttled, and then the state wants literally hundreds of dollars to even go into a discussion if we could utilize the facility. And then if you recall, under the Crystal Creek Boys Camp, that the state wanted to charge a very high rental rate for that property that there was huge discussion on at the time when it was operating. So that appears to be a no-starter for at least a work camp there. But as I said earlier, we are looking at the detention annex to see what it would cost to get that up to current standards. And we're looking at that. That used to house about 80 inmates. And then, of course, we'd have to cover the operational costs. And as we are in a very critical need for an additional jail, Mr. Lees is very concerned with the operational cost of it. We do have to look out maybe about 5 years to see where the economy may be in 5 years to see if we can afford the operational costs, but definitely the need is there. I have some ideas to make it work, but we're going to be facing some very difficult decisions in the very near future to see if we proceed for the additional jail project. And it's all coming at a time when at least some discussion with other entities for revenue sharing and see if we can make that work as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chief. During Mr. Lee's reporting, he alluded to some alternatives to actual jail time to reduce recidivism rates. Can you identify some of those efforts?
Would you ask that question again? I'm not sure.
Mr. Lee's referred to the possibility of efforts within your department to reduce recidivism rates rather than simply to jail time. I'm assuming that effort would come through your department.
Excuse me, no, I actually was referring to the efforts that the sheriff was undertaking as it relates to monitoring with the GPS devices and those types of things to reduce the jail time.
Are there efforts beyond monitoring? When I think of reducing recidivism rates, I don't think about how we monitor. I think about how we reteach.
The assessment center.
Well, in regards to the realignment plan, there are three primary components. One of them is strongly on the initial part, which is the assessment. We need to assess the individuals, know who we need to be supervising first of all. So it's the higher risk individuals, because the research says that you spend a lot of time on the lower risk individuals, you actually create them as more criminals. So you focus on the right, high-end population, and then you focus on their targeted criminogenic needs. Our plan is designed to create and target those criminogenic needs after that assessment, after we supervise them adequately. The part about the jail and the consequences is that I've been in law enforcement long. Well, first of all, I'm a very strong supporter of rehabilitation. Okay, I believe that people can change. Yeah, and so that's my background, my philosophy. I think that that's why I stayed in probation rather than some other law enforcement job. However, I do believe in those years that having a level of a consequence or a hammer is very important. And some individuals, 10% is easy to say, 10% are not going to respond to our efforts to rehabilitate them. And there will need to be some kind of custody alternative for them, whether it's prison, whether it's jail, whether it's lockup facility. Others can actually be motivated by that hammer. So if we give them opportunities to choose rehabilitative avenues and they choose not to, then the quick incarceration, we refer to it as flash incarceration, is new in the legislation. Instead of a long-term or escalating each time they make a mistake, that you say start with 30 days, and next time they make a mistake, you add 60 days and 90 days and so on and so forth. That's proven not to work. But the flash, immediate consequences, the hammer availability is something that can help motivate individuals. And so from our point of view, what this realignment plan provided an opportunity for is for us to change the way we're doing business with individuals. So let's identify the ones that we think that can actually make that change. Let's use our tools to change their motivation, get them in the right targeted interventions, and actually change their thinking patterns so they don't want to commit crimes anymore. That in terms will help us reduce some of the need for custody time. But without the custody time, a part of that motivation is not there.
So the combined effort is still necessary.
Yes.
Thank you, Chief.
Supervisor Hawes.
Well, I want to take a moment and thank the city officials that are here today. This is great that you're here listening to this, because I know it's very high on your list also. And I did have a question for the sheriff. What would happen if you put more prisoners in the jail than your occupancy states? I know that happened way back, and I think we got into some trouble over that, didn't we?
That's a very good question, because we would likely be sued, and AB 109 is presenting some new problems with suits that were coming against the state of California, the way inmates were housed in the prisons. And now, since we're still housing state inmates, the parolees, those suits are starting to transfer over into the counties of the conditions in your facility and the way your facility is constructed and have the different services. So that's going to be a big concern in the future for counties. But the bottom line, if you decided to just say, forget about it and pack inmates into the jail and overcrowd it, we would definitely be sued for the conditions, and we would likely lose that suit, and it's very costly. And then we'd be, of course, expending very precious taxpayer dollars in an award for a suit to an inmate.
Well, you mentioned the detention annex. I see that there's no activity on the little bit of farmland down there. Couldn't some of these people that are off be out there doing something?
That's another good question, because that goes with the expansion of our work release program. Right now, we have them going to a number of nonprofits and performing work out there, or for churches, or in the case for the Northern California Veterans Cemetery, where they do work out there. They also perform work within the county. The thing is, when they don't show up, and many of them don't because of the lack of jail capacity, then we need the hammer, which is the consequence of incarceration. That's where these beds for out-of-county use are going to be very important. And then also a step up or an escalation of monitoring for the GPS electronic monitoring that can also bring a higher level of accountability and consequence for those people that do not want to comply. Okay, thank you.
Any others? Okay, seeing none, I want to thank Chief Foreman for your presentation, and Sheriff Pasenko as well. And Sheriff, I'd like to just congratulate you on your excellent idea to keep part of your capacity available for the FTAs. I think it's a great way to send a very strong message to those who don't show up for our courts, that you will get some consequences, and perhaps we can further that along in the future. So thank you both for your time.
Thank you very much, and it's been a long road in getting that open, and we are working on restoring that accountability, and very much so, and I look forward to working with the partners that we have on the executive board for the Community Corrections Partnership. Thank you.
Thank you, Sheriff. Okay, we're going to take a 5-minute break.